Hey folks, welcome back to History Chat on Thursday afternoons at 1 o'clock, where today we're doing the history of the Republican Party, and I believe this is the fifth installment in that series. And today we'll talk about how the Republican Party in the late 19th century becomes wedded to big business, and there's some really good stories here in the midst of all this. So where I left you last week was with the idea that in the early 1870s, the attempt on the part of Republicans who wanted to replace Grant as the head of the party had mainstreamed the idea that any kind of aid for African Americans after the Civil War was essentially a redistribution of wealth. And when they did that, when they made that argument mainstream, they were picking up an argument that Andrew Johnson had made in his vetoes in 1866 that I talked about before, and certainly that Southern recalcitrant former Confederates had been making, that they said they really didn't care that much about whether or not formerly enslaved people were black. Of course they did. But they were worried that they were poor, so they were going to redistribute wealth by voting for policies that would cost tax dollars that fell onto white landowners. Now, that being said, first of all, that language has lived with us to this day. But what's important about the Republican Party in that early 1870 period is that they mainstream that. You know, the Southern Democrats had been saying that immediately after the war, and everyone's like, who cares what they say? They lost. It's when the Republicans mainstream it in the early 1870s that make it really part of our national discourse from then to the present. So that's where I left you. And I left you with the election of 1872, which Grant does eke out. He does win. And after the 1872 election, the people who began to make that argument before it, the people who backed Horace Greeley for president in 72, and the people 1872, and the people who both disliked Grant and disliked Grant's policies, get even angrier after the 1872 election. They feel like Horace Greeley has been treated badly. They feel like their ideas haven't been given enough um, they have not been given enough attention in the political realm, and they hit Grant harder and harder and harder with the idea that what he is trying to do in the South by leveling the playing field between former enslavers and formerly enslaved people is a redistribution of wealth. And in 1874, you're going to get, for example, a rebirth of that whole taxpayer protest movement that began in 1871. So you get these increasingly visible tax protests where people don't say we don't like African American voting because we don't like black people, although it's the exact same people who were participating in the KKK, for example, but they say we don't like them participating in the governmental system because they're voting to redistribute wealth. So one of the things that's really interesting about the construction of this imagery at the time is that when they're talking about how this system of trying to level the playing field is sucking dry tax dollars, let me give you what those numbers look like in today's money. So what the U.S. government was spending in the fiscal year of 1871 to 1872, the fiscal year does not match the calendar year, in today's dollars is about $4 billion, which is, just minuscule compared to what we deal with now. But the U.S. government collected less than $2 billion in taxes, and it ran a surplus that year of $1.4 billion. Again, that's in today's dollars. It's different back then. But the point here is that these complaints about the redistribution of wealth through taxation are really not realistic. It is an image of what was happening, not what was really happening. And increasingly in the late 1870s, this concept of the redistribution of wealth of people at the bottom, either African Americans in the South or largely immigrants or workers in the urban cities, voting for policies that would give them schools, for example, and better roads, which would make it easier for them to do business in carts, for example, or prosthetics, which are really important after the Civil War because people have lost arms and legs and eyes. Actually, eyes is a big thing. So that idea increasingly in the late 1870s becomes not simply that voting for policies that would actually give benefits to people at the bottom are a form of socialism or communism or redistribution of wealth. but also anything that restricts business, anything that regulates business. And in the mid 1870s, you get the rise in the Midwest of a group of people called Grangers. And you probably remember from high school people talking about the Granger Laws. And the you know what? I'm going to adjust this and see if this is helping. Some of you are talking about the. I wonder if that's going to help the sound better. Some people say the sound is good. All right, so sorry about that. So you might remember hearing about the Granger Laws. Well, the Granger Laws were people in the Midwest who took a look at the fact that theoretically they were supposed to be able to rise on their own through farming and selling their product. But the reality was they were dependent on the railroads, there would be one railroad that came through their town, and the grain elevator operators, the people who would store their grain for sale at the market, because those were the guys who got to decide how much they were going to pay for the grain. They would grade it, and they would say, oh, your grain is only like a bottom grade, when in fact it was a top grade. And the farmers had no recourse because there was a monopoly there. So they start to put restrictions around the railroads and around the grain operators, and these become known as the Granger Laws. And instantly, businessmen look at the Granger Laws and at the restrictions that states are putting on what the railroads and the grain elevator operators can do. And they say, hold everything. This is communism, because you are, in a sense, redistributing wealth. That is, you're not letting us make all the money we could. You're putting restrictions on that. Therefore, you're interfering with our ability to make money, and you are giving that money that we should be able to make to someone else. Now, that sounds really convoluted, but I think it's really important to understand it now, because this is the same argument that in the 20th century you're going to hear people like Barry Goldwater making. And again, in the present, you're going to hear Republicans making this argument that any kind of business regulation is communism. And that's it's really a very American construct. That's not what communism is or ever was. It comes straight out of this after the Civil War period, when any kind of social programs for African Americans or immigrants and any kind of regulation on business becomes seen or perceived or spoken of as communism. And it's really just kind of a weird moniker for what is pretty reasonable regulation of the monopolies that railroads and grain elevator operators had on business in the Midwest. So anyway, there is growing in the 1870s this sense in America that things are starting to move upward. But if you remember, the Republican Party is supposed to be about improving conditions for people at the bottom so they can make more money, and they in turn will raise somebody up above them and on up in what one of my students once called sort of a pyramid scheme, although obviously they didn't see it that way at the time. And this really gets exacerbated in 1873. And I sort of feel like I need to apologize, because I'm listening to myself, and I remember being in high school and thinking, what the expletive is going on with some of these things I'm supposed to hear about, and who cares? And this is one of them. It's the crime of 73. And I hope you'll I don't know, survive my trip through the weeds here, but I actually think it's really interesting, and it does matter. So what happens is that there is in 1873 a business panic, and it comes because the country has way overinvested in railroads and they crash. But something happens in Congress in that year. So you got the economy crash. It's 73, and people are out of work, and they're in real trouble. But there's a real shortage of money. And in the early 1870s in the West, especially in Nevada, miners have discovered silver lodes, tons of silver. Now, in the original law in which the Congress provided for rules about making coins in America, they provided for a ratio of silver coins to gold. So that is, and I think the ratio was 16-1, saying that if you had an ounce of gold, it was equivalent to 16 ounces of silver. Well, nobody really coined silver because there wasn't any silver in this part of the Americas, and it was very, very expensive. So that ratio of whatever, I think it was 16 to 1, was kind of useless because silver was so incredibly expensive. Nobody actually coined silver. But when you when they discover silver in, especially in Nevada in the early 1870s, all of a sudden the price of silver plummets. So if you could still make silver coins at a ratio of 16 to 1 to gold coins, farmers and small businessmen would be in incredible shape because they'd have this cheap money, essentially. Well, Congress is actually in the process in 1873 of doing a routine reworking of the currency laws. And they look at this situation, and Congress is, of course, dominated by people of wealth in this period. They look at this situation and they're like, oh, crap, we can't let this happen because all of a sudden the gold's not going to be valuable and we're the ones doing the lending out. And they rewrite the currency laws saying you can't coin silver. And or rather you coin it, it's the ratio becomes much, much higher. And when that happens, people at the bottom look at this and they're like, you just took away all of our money. You kept talking about how great God was and he put stuff here on this continent for us to be able to rise. We found silver in the ground where God left it. And the minute we got that and it looked like we were going to be able to level the playing field again, you took that away from us. So that's why the crime of 73 becomes such a political football. I mean, you look here now and you say, really, who cares about coinage laws? Well, if it were a difference between you being able to start a business or pay for your farm or do any of those things and the guys back east who run the banks having everything, the crime of 73 actually becomes a really, really big deal. So that happens in 73. And the reason I set it up that way is because, actually, here's a little bit of an aside for you. If you ever hear the expression that Grandpa bought the farm, that's from this era. And it comes from one of these money struggles. In order to get a mortgage on your farm especially in places like Kansas, you had to have a life insurance policy. You've got life insurance coming on in this period. And there's a big argument about whether or not that's okay because you're kind of gaming God. But you had to have a life insurance policy on covering the mortgage in case you died. So when Grandpa died, he bought the farm. Anyway, side there. So what happens after the crime of 73 and this panic of 73 is that in 1874, the Democrats take the House of Representatives and they say, we are going to stop working for business. We are going to make sure that the laws affect everybody equally. And one of the laws that we're going to be eyeing here are these tariffs that the Republicans swear by so thoroughly. The idea that they have these walls around America that are supposed to protect everybody equally within America. But already by 74, it's pretty clear that industrialists are able to use those tariffs and then cooperate with each other to collude to raise prices. So the Democrats are not so keen on those tariffs because they're really rolling down onto working men who have to pay higher prices for things than they would have to if there was foreign competition. So in 74, the Democrats take the House and they start to put pressure on the Republicans. And then we get the election of 1876. And this is, the contested election of 1876. But bear with me in these, in the next few decades, because a lot of what you've learned about these is important for different reasons than you've been told. And a lot of it is actually really interesting. So what happens in the 76 election is that the election comes down to two candidates. The Democrat is a guy named Samuel Tilden from New York City, and he's a reform lawyer who's known for having broken the machine politicians in New York City. So he represents taking back America for sort of the little guy, to get rid of this corruption in politics. And on the other hand, you have Rutherford B. Hayes from Ohio, and he was in the Civil War. He actually kept a diary his whole life. So we know a lot more about Hayes than we know about a lot of people. His whole life he kept a diary, and it's available, by the way, if anybody's interested. It's lots of it's less interesting than you would think, and that's coming from somebody who likes this stuff a lot. Anyway, So it comes down to the two of them, and the election becomes just an absolute nightmare. And one of my favorite trivia bits from the election is that the night of the election, grave robbers tried to steal Abraham Lincoln's body from its resting spot because they were hoping to hold it for ransom. They didn't succeed, but it just sort of sets the tone for the whole election. Because what happens is that Samuel Tilden wins the popular vote by 51%. He gets 51% of the popular vote, and Hayes only gets 48%. But at the same time, it's pretty clear that a lot of Republican, especially African American Republicans, have been kept from voting in the South. But there's also been fraud in New York City that's kept Democrats away. The election is simply a mess. And what it comes down to is that even though Hayes has lost the popular vote by quite a significant amount, Tilden has not picked up all the votes he needs in the Electoral College. He needs one more vote in the Electoral College. And it turns out that there's going to be contested returns from 4 states. Everybody thinks there's 3, there's actually 4. It's Oregon, South Carolina, Florida, and Louisiana. All of them have turned in contested results for this election, so it's not clear who won. What happens then is that Congress puts together a committee of people to go and try and figure out what happened. And what they're really focusing on is in the South, where it's pretty clear that African Americans have been kept from the vote, and yet Tilden has won. So who really won that election? While they are down trying to figure out what happened, there's actually something funny that goes on with the commission itself. It's supposed to be equally bipartisan, and the chair of it is supposed to be completely non-committal. And at the last second, the guy who's supposed to be non-committal accepts an appointment elsewhere in the government and gets replaced by a Republican. So you can see where this is going to go, and everybody could see where this is going to go. But the other piece that's important about this whole crisis, and remember, the election's in November, and no one knows who won. So the Democrats are literally organizing militias to say we're gonna put our guy in the White House by force. We won this election by a lot. And Grant responds to that by saying, go ahead and try it, guys. I'll declare martial law. So if you're a Democrat looking at this, you're like, oh my God, we've got a dictatorship. And if you're a Republican, you're like, these Yahoo Democrats are going to be out in the streets killing people because they're not getting what they wanted. And so you've got these months of extraordinary turmoil, and it's a really big deal. Again, in the textbooks, it's sort of like, whatever. I mean, literally, people thought there was going to be another civil war. And in the midst of all this, Thomas Scott, you may remember me talking about Thomas Scott in other contexts because he's so important. He's a major railroad baron. And he goes down to people he knows in southern states, and he says, look, I have a lot of clout, and he does. I have a lot of clout. If you will switch your electors to support Rutherford B. Hayes, I'll make sure the South gets railroad contracts, good federal railroad contracts. And that matters. I mean, a lot of things matter, but that really matters, and it's going to matter a lot in just a few months, which is why I'm focusing on that right now. And he happens, it works. The Southern electors switch their votes, and Rutherford B. Hayes, having lost the popular vote by 2 percentage points, about 250,000 votes, gets put into the White House. Well, you can imagine what this looks like to you if you're a Democrat, right? The Republicans just stole the White House. It's the first time, by the way, that somebody is installed in the White House with a minority of the popular vote being installed through the Electoral College. And just so you know, it's happened 4 times in American history. And interestingly enough, for all the fact that Republicans today keep talking about Democrats stealing elections, all 4 of those times it's been a Democrat who wins the election and a Republican who wins in the Electoral College. And that there's a number of reasons for that, but I think that's, again, a really interesting point to have in the backs of your minds. All right, so Hayes takes office, and he actually recognizes that he's got to make amends across regional lines and across political lines. So he does a number of things to try and bring Democrats on board. First of all, he he puts in a Southern Democrat to be postmaster in his cabinet. And a lot of people look at that and they're like, postmaster, who cares? That was such a wimpy place to put someone. In fact, that's probably the key patronage position in the entire government, because every small town has a politically appointed postmaster at that point. And what that does is it enables the postmaster general to put Democrats in positions of power across the South. So that's a really big deal. Hayes also refuses to let the military protect the Republican state governments in the South, especially in South Carolina. There's a number of states that still had in 1876 Republican governments that were supported by black votes. When they lose in 1876 because of voter suppression, although again, we will never really know what the vote should have been because the votes were so unclear in those southern states. But when they lose, Hayes says to the governors in those states, I can't keep protecting you with the military. I just can't do it. It is a terrible thing to show the world or to show Americans that you're staying in power only with the help of bayonets. And so he withdraws the troops from around the South Carolina State House. Let me walk you through that, because this is where we get that idea that this is the end of Reconstruction. It is not. They took the troops out of the South in 1877 and it was the end of Reconstruction. That is 1,000% a myth. That did not happen. It was a construction of the late 19th century. What happens in April of 1877 is that Hayes says to the governor of South Carolina, who's a Republican, who was lost in the 1876 election, but who says it's a fraudulent election, and that governor has moved troops from their barracks in Columbia, South Carolina, which is now the waiting pool in front of the reflection pool, I guess. Not waiting, don't go stand in it. The reflection pool in front of the University of South Carolina library. That's where the troops were stationed. That's where the barracks were. So the barracks, and if you know Columbia, South Carolina, you know it's almost a stone's throw from there to the State House. And when the Democratic candidate for governor in South Carolina, Wade Hampton, came to take office after the election, the current governor said, "Ain't happening. I won this election because you guys cheated." And he gets the troops to come and surround the State House. They will not let the Democrats come in. They have surrounded the State House. Hayes says, I have to order those guys to go back to their barracks. And he does, and that's what they do. They simply walk away from the State House back to their barracks. Maybe took them 15 minutes, tops, if they weren't walking very quickly. That's it. That's the removal of troops. That's all it is. They go from the State House back to their barracks, maybe a quarter of a mile. I'm not great at distances, maybe a half a mile, but probably not. Really, really small maneuver. And it's going to become blown up hugely in the 1890s, which I hope to get to explain to you. But what's important about that is that it is the moment at which Democrats in the South are able to take over all the southern states and destroy democracy there. They're not really going to let African Americans vote in commanding ways again until the 1960s. And of course, that got snuffed out very quickly as well. You have to think about the South in this period as a place that's an oligarchy. It's been suppressed. Voting has been suppressed. All right. So I did talk about how that removal becomes a big deal in my last series. So I guess I won't waste any more time on it now, but that's all it is. And so every time I hear, everything should end in 1877 because that's the end of Reconstruction, the troops never left the South. I mean, we staged the Spanish-American War from the southern military installations. What happened was, and the reason that people weld these two things together, is that by 1877, you've got the Plains Indian Wars having heated up dramatically after the Battle of Little Bighorn in 1876. So you have more troops moving out to the west, and then you have this happening. And this is that all of this that I just talked about happens in April. Hayes is inaugurated in March. The troops move away from the State House in April. Summer is coming, and summer is often when people are in the streets, and that's precisely what happens. In July of 1877, there's a major strike along the B&O Railroad, which is the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad, which is the big railroad in the center of the nation. And when that happens, the strikers on the B&O want better pay and better conditions, but they shut down the railroads, and that strike spreads across the country. Now, to people who are not willing to entertain the idea that strikers need what they're asking for, this looks a lot like the Paris Commune. It looks a lot like the same thing that people have been afraid of since 1871, when workers took over society and in Paris, and appeared, at least to Americans, to destroy society, to redistribute wealth. So there's a real pushback against the strikers on the B&O in what's known as the Great Railroad Strike of 1877. And this is, of course, across America, across the B&O and the railroad lines. And when that happens, Rutherford B. Hayes calls out the military. And so a lot of the Southern troops do, in fact, move up to put down the strikes along the railroads. That being said, guess whose railroad was the centerpiece of the Great Railroad Strike? Thomas Scott. That's why I made such a big deal about him before. So again, if you're watching this at the time and you're seeing that Thomas Scott is the one who got Hayes put into the White House, or at least that's the way you perceive it, and 4 months later, the president calls out the troops to back Thomas Scott's business, you just throw your hands up. I mean, the country's over, as far as you can tell. In response to the calling out of the troops for the Great Railroad Strike in 1877, we get two very important things. First of all, we get the passage of what's known as the Posse Comitatus Act, which is still the fundamental law governing when troops can be used domestically in America. And I've talked a lot about Posse Comitatus on the History and Politics chats, and I think probably in the other big history chat I did. Posse Comitatus said that the U.S. troops could not be used domestically against Americans. So there's caveats to that, and it's a much longer discussion, but that is actually the fundamental law about when the troops can be called out against Americans, except in certain cases, first of all. Second of all, Posse Comitatus does one other really important thing that I'm not going to be talking about today, although if I do something on the Plains Indians, I will. Posse Comitatus is 1878, and what it says is that you can't use U.S. troops against American citizens. What that does is it means the Army can't protect the Indians. And so you're going to see a major escalation here in white incursions on indigenous peoples, because the Army can no longer legally turn their guns against other Americans, and the Indian police are not really able to take over because of, if they pull a gun on a settler, the settler's going to pull a gun right back. Anyway, so that's one road I'm not going to go down today. But the other road is that after the Great Railroad Strike and the response to the Great Railroad Strike, voters put Democrats into power in the House of Representatives in 1870. The House of Representatives in 74, and in 78, they turned the Senate over to Democrats. So what this means is both the House and the Senate are going to be democratically controlled in 1879. All right, why does this matter? It matters because this is actually such a great story that I actually was the one to find, although you can find it elsewhere now. And someday I will write more on it, because I've written a lot on it, but it's interesting because what happens is once the Democrats take over Congress in 1879, what they really do is they put a lot of former Confederates back in office. I mean, literally, they put former Confederates back in office. And they of course control the Congress. And one of the first things they try and do is get rid of everything having to do with Reconstruction. And literally, at one point, they try to get a pension for Jefferson Davis out of the federal government. And they get madder and madder. They have an all-night session, and they get madder and madder at each other, the Republicans and the Democrats. And the Democrats go so far that the next day they get their speeches expunged from the federal record because they know they're basically talking like Confederates. I mean, they were Confederate. They're probably all drinking too, by the way, now that I think about it. But so anyway, after this in 79, they try and starve the government. They try and cut off funding for the government so that Rutherford B. Hayes has to do what they want, which is to remove all the troops from the South. But that's, as I say, never going to happen. But they're trying to make that happen. And in the process of trying to make that happen, they simply say, we're just not going to give you any money until you do what we say. And so Hayes calls them back into summer session and says, pass the freaking budget bill, and they're like, ain't happening. And the out of the blue comes the House Minority Leader, a guy named James Garfield of Ohio, who says, this is treason. This is this is just as bad as when they were fighting in the battlefields. They're trying to destroy the U.S. government, and we're not going to put up with it. And this is why anybody's ever heard of Garfield. They do in fact manage Hayes and Garfield do in fact manage to make the Confederates back down. And I'm not going to tell you much more about the Democrats really in this series, but this is the point when the Democrats recognize that they've got to toss over the old Confederates and come up with a new ideology, which they're going to do in about 2 minutes. Anyway, when the Democrats take over Congress, what that means then is that the Republicans know that they've got to do something to win in 1880 in a big way. And they also really double down with big business because they need big business money. So what happens going into the election of 1880 is that a lot of the old businessmen who had first turned to Grant want to reelect Grant again. He's had 2 terms, but there's no law yet, or there's no constitutional amendment saying he can't have a third. So they want to turn to him. And this horrifies a lot of people who are like, wait a minute, he ain't Washington, and Washington only had 2. Why should Grant have a third? And those are the ones who are known as stalwarts. There's this big fight that most people know the names or have heard of the names. The names don't matter at all. I'm only throwing it out there, so if you've heard it, you'll know who that is. The pro-Grant people are, of course, led by Roscoe Conkling. It's going to matter in a minute. Roscoe Conkling, the guy I told you about before, who just wants to run New York, but who has strong Wall Street ties. Other people look at this and they're like, we're sick of Conkling and Grant, and we need to have somebody else. And they're known as the half-breeds. It's a crazy reason. It doesn't matter. And they back James G. Blaine of Maine, who's also known as corrupt. And these two people, these two factions, the stalwarts and the half-breeds, go head-to-head at the convention, and they have to compromise on a third candidate, and that third candidate is a pretty obvious person to turn to in 1880 after the fight I just told you about, and that's James Garfield, James A. Garfield of Ohio. Brilliant man, by the way, philosopher, speaks a number of languages, thoroughly devoted to his wife after an early affair that almost drove her away forever. A really bright man and a strongly principled man as well. And one who really wanted, he was a Lincoln Republican. He really wanted to go back to what Lincoln had talked about, to leveling the playing field for African Americans. So Garfield wins in the 1880 election, but just barely. He by less than 10,000 votes out of almost 9 million votes cast. In order, though, to keep the Conkling wing happy, the Grant wing happy, for vice president, the Republicans have turned to a guy named Chester Arthur. And Chester Arthur has never held elective office. He has basically run New York City for the Republicans, and he is basically corrupt. And they put him on the ticket to kind of shut up the Grant Conkling wing. By the way, you can still see in New York the building where Chet Arthur's law office was, and there is a plaque. It's an Indian restaurant now, but it's kind of cool just to look it up and go. I mean, cool for people like me. A friend took me there this winter. Anyway, so what happens is Conkling expects that Garfield has won only because of his help. He did give some speeches for Garfield. So he shows up to Garfield's, office and says, okay, now start handing the goods over to me. And Garfield says, no, I don't owe you anything. And Conkling gets furious, and he basically declares war on the Garfield administration. So Garfield, for his first 9 months in office, is locked into this battle with Conkling, and Conkling finally wants to demonstrate that he runs the party, not Garfield. And so he resigns from the Senate, fully expecting that the New York's legislature is going to put him back in office. And that's going to prove that Garfield can't do anything without Conkling, because Conkling commands New York with all of its electoral votes and all of its money out of Wall Street. And in following Conkling, the other senator from New York, a guy named Thomas Platt, also resigns. He becomes known in eternity as Me Too Platt. And they both go home and expect to be triumphantly reelected, and they're not. And so all of a sudden, Conkling is out of work and out of luck. And I'm going to explain in a second why that matters. But finally, Garfield is like, great, I can now put my plans in order. And in the first, as I say, months of his administration, he has isn't even 9. I'll tell you how many it was. In the first period of his administration, he has put down Conkling, and he has also managed to nurse his wife, whom he adored. Her name was Lucretia. He called her Crete. He's nursed her through malaria, which she's caught from the mosquitoes in the Potomac. And he's finally like, this is great. I've got a future here. I can finally have control of my administration. And then, and this is why I wanted to do this today, on July 2nd, 1881, as he is walking across the railway station in Washington, D.C., a mentally deranged office seeker who supported Conkling and that wing of the party comes up behind him and shoots him in the back and says, I am a stalwart, and now Arthur is president. And he really believed that he was going to get a job out of all that. His name was Charles Guiteau, and his story is a fascinating one. I have to recommend, if you're interested, that you watch the PBS Garfield special. I was very fortunate to be able to work a lot on that. It was not my brainchild, but they did a really lovely job on that. And there's a lot of really good information on it. It's based on Candace Millard's book, The Murder of a President. Anyway, so Garfield is not dead for a while. He's going to die a very horrible death of infection introduced by his doctor, who didn't believe in germs. But he is going to die, and in his place, we're going to get Chester Arthur. And Chester Arthur was a corrupt, never elected, man about town. And interestingly enough, when he rose to the presidency, he grew into the position. Conkling shows up and says, this is great, now we're going to run the country. And Arthur says, no, we're not. I'm going to run the country because I'm the president, and it's not a game any longer. And of course, he doesn't stand a chance of being reelected, but I've always had kind of a soft spot for Chester Arthur because everybody hated him, right? The Republicans hated him because Conkling's Republicans hated him because he wouldn't do what Conkling said, and Garfield Republicans hated him because he'd replaced Garfield, and the Democrats hated him because he was a Republican. But he could have done a lot of damage, and he didn't. He was a good president. Anyway, on the heels of that, Americans, voters in general, are just sick of the Republican Party. They think they're all corrupt. And in 1883, first of all, we get the Pendleton Civil Service Act, which gets rid of patronage posts, the idea that we should have a nonpartisan civil service where people are not beholden to a president. They're beholden to the system itself. That's 1883. It's known as the Civil Service Act, or the Pendleton Act, named after George Pendleton, the guy who sponsored it in Congress. Arthur signs it, of course, but it's a Democratic bill. And then in 1884, we get the election of Grover Cleveland as president, the first Democrat to be elected president after the Civil War. And Cleveland is one of those new Democrats. He basically says, I'm not going to fight the Confederacy's ideas all over again. I'm going to focus on the cities, and I'm going to focus on cleaning them up. I'm a reformer, and I'm going to focus on really making sure that government answers to everybody. And Cleveland is, although he's a Democrat, he actually, they've been wedded to white supremacy in the 19th century. Cleveland actually integrates the New York City police force, among other things. So he's this kind of new Democrat. Anyway, when Cleveland is elected, he is elected at least in part because people want to get rid of those tariffs I talked about, the idea of these laws that are protecting big business and enabling them to collude to raise prices. And the Democrats, who represent regular Americans by now, say, we've got to get rid of these things. So when Cleveland comes in and promises that he's going to get rid of tariffs, Republicans panic. Now, they don't have to panic quite as much as they're going to have to in a few minutes, because they do still hold the Senate, and the Senate's going to stop anything. They know that. But they also know the writing's on the wall, that they are no longer popular. They no longer can command the popular vote, and they got to do something. So the minute that Cleveland gets elected, they start to flood the country with literature about how wonderful tariffs are. They're the best thing since sliced bread. They're the only thing protecting the economy. And if you don't support tariffs, you're essentially a communist or an anarchist. And this is the theme that they push again and again and again through the period from 1885 when Cleveland's inaugurated through 1888, through the election of 1888. Well, everything is riding on the election of 1888, and it's one of my favorite and least favorite elections in American history because it's so freaking corrupt. It's really unbelievable how corrupt the election of 1888 is, and the fact that we have sort of forgotten it, and the presidency of Benjamin Harrison is, to my mind, a huge societal failing, because like all you guys are probably sitting out there going, Benjamin Harrison, wasn't he like some relative of William Henry Harrison? Yes, he was. But like, what do you know about Benjamin Harrison? Believe me, you should know a lot about Benjamin Harrison, because we are still living with Benjamin Harrison's actions. And I'm going to explain a lot of them here, but I will not be able to give the attention to the Wounded Knee Massacre that it deserves. And it is Harrison who oversaw, and his people who instigated, the Wounded Knee Massacre. Something, of course, very dear to my heart. I wrote a book on it. And this is how I know so much about the Harrison administration. I bet I'm one of the only people in the world who's read the Harrison papers. Anyway. They're actually kind of interesting. Actually, they're quite interesting. Anyway, so what happens is the Republicans are determined to win in 1888 because they want to protect that tariff. At this point, they are completely wedded to big business, to the point that if you sat in the Senate, you literally talked about yourself as the senator for the Sugar Trust or something. And even places like the New York Times, stories are appearing where people are saying, basically the senators are just bought and paid for. And that's in the New York Times, which is affiliated, not officially affiliated, but it's the paper of Wall Street. So there's this sense that the government has been taken over by the rich. And the Republicans like that. They think that this is the only way to run society, because if you let those people at the bottom vote, they're going to vote to redistribute wealth through things like getting rid of the tariff, which the Republicans think is vital to protecting the American economy and therefore American jobs. So what happens is, coming up to the election of 1888, it's, as I say, enormously corrupt. So first of all, this is the first time we get the modern system of campaign finance, and it's pioneered by a guy named John Wanamaker from Philadelphia. A lot of you may know him because he also pioneered the department store. And what he does is he goes around to big businessmen and he says, you like that tariff? You better pony up some cash here so that we can protect it. And he creates a campaign war chest funded by big business. Now, this is in part because of that Pendleton Act I just talked about before in 1883, because until then, funding of campaigns came from the fact that if you held a government job for a party, you owed part of your salary back to the party so it could keep getting reelected. Well, once you get the Pendleton Act, you don't have nearly that kind of cash coming in, so you have to turn somewhere else. The Republican Party turns to big business, and it's Wanamaker who does that. I noticed last year I was in Philadelphia a couple of times, and there's a big plaque for Philadelphia there by the State House, and it doesn't mention his role in campaign financing, which I think is interesting because it's a big deal. So there's that. There is the campaign financing. Also, there is a lot of employers go to their employees and say, if you vote for Cleveland, don't expect to come to work the next day. Because again, ballots are still color-coded. You can't split the ticket. They're produced by the party, and everybody knows how everybody else votes. So they simply say, unless you're dropping a ballot in the box for Harrison, don't bother to come to work the next day. So what happens in 1888 then is that Harrison actually loses the election. He loses the election by about 100,000 votes. It's the second time we're going to have a popular vote go one direction and the electoral vote go the other way. And that's precisely what happens in 1888. Harrison loses the popular vote, but there's a sleight of hand in the counting of the electoral college votes. There's an important switch. And when that happens, Harrison becomes president. And when that happens, he's devoutly religious, and he turns to his campaign manager, Mark Hanna, and he says, Providence has given us this victory. And Hanna later says to somebody, Providence hadn't a damn thing to do with it. A number of men were compelled to approach the penitentiary to make him president. Great line from American history. So as soon as they're elected, which always floors me because, of course, Cleveland has won again, but he has to move out of the White House. And I would love to be a fly on the wall for that, where he's like, yeah, I won, but I'm on my way out. And he firmly believes that big business has destroyed American democracy. And this is one of the things I suspect that makes him think that, is because he won, but he lost. Anyways, so as soon as they're in office, Harrison's men decide they've got to make sure that another Democrat never wins. And so what they do is, first of all, they promptly go ahead and arrange for the admission of 4 new states. And that's going to be North Dakota, South Dakota, Montana, and Washington. And the argument, there's a long backstory to this. But what's happened is that there has been a fight for a long time about the admission of territories from the West. And generally, Republicans think they're going to get certain states and Democrats think they're going to get other states. And they've been fighting back and forth about which states are going to be admitted. And finally, they have come up in the previous Congress with a plan that each party's going to get 2 states. The minute that Harrison is elected and gets control of both houses of Congress, the Democrats know they have to cut a deal. So they cut a deal in which they hope to get 1 state, which is Montana, knowing the Republicans are going to take the other states, which would be Washington, and then they split North and South Dakota. Dakota Territory was one territory. They split it in half into North and South Dakota. Of course, South Dakota is part of what was known at the time as the Great Sioux Reservation. It belongs to the Lakota, which is how the Lakota end up completely screwed by the Harrison administration. They've got to get the Lakota off their land to get a railroad in there, to get settlers in there. When that doesn't really work out, obviously we get the Wounded Knee Massacre. And then, just because it's in the news now, then we get the construction of Mount Rushmore with the fervid hope that they're going to be able to attract at least tourists, because they haven't been able to attract any settlers. All right, so first they get these 4 new states, and they say this. They talk about exactly what they're going to do because they've bought a major newspaper called Frank Leslie's Illustrated Newspaper, which is basically the Fox News channel of the Harrison administration. And they put this all in the newspaper. They say this is what they're doing. And they say, look at this. We managed to make sure that we're never going to lose the Senate because each of these new states are going to give us 2 senators. And we're also always going to control the Electoral College because we're going to have 3 from each of these states. And by the way, we're going to get Montana too. And they did. Montana actually elects Democrats when it's admitted as a state, and the Republicans look at it and say, it's a fraudulent election, and they put Republicans in their places. Then the next year, when they're worried that maybe it's still not good enough as people are turning against them, they admit 2 more states. They admit Idaho and Wyoming, and they're in such a hurry to admit Idaho and Wyoming that they don't go through the proper channels for Idaho. They simply ask for volunteers to write a state constitution, and then it just gets accepted. So in the space of 12 months between 1889 and 1890, we get 6 new states. The biggest acquisition of states since the original 13, and there's really not enough settlers in them to have that, which is why they do it so quickly, because they don't want to wait for the 1890 census, which is going to show there aren't enough settlers in those places to go ahead and admit them. Unlike Arizona and New Mexico, which have tons and tons and tons of people, but are expected to go Democratic. So we get these new states. That's one thing they do. They also institute the secret ballot, which is designed to guarantee that people who can't read can't vote. And what's funny about that is they make sure, they keep saying this is about getting rid of Democratic votes, but privately in their papers, Republicans are like, we're not sure our people can vote either. And they try and have lessons for people being able to read a ballot. And And the letters about that are just wonderful because they're like, why can't our people read? And just basically that they're trying to create a new system by which they can simply manipulate things to win because they no longer have the popular vote. All right, everything looks ducky, right? Except it's not. People are so unhappy with the Republican Party by the summer of 1890, and there's such a drought on the Western Plains. The summer of 1890 is known as the Alliance Summer. And with this, the Alliance Summer, this is when you have orators like Mary Elizabeth Lease going around the plains talking about how people have to take back the government from the rich, from the Republicans. She's the one who tells farmers to raise less corn and more hell, and says that this is no longer a government of the people, by the people, and for the people, but of Wall Street, by Wall Street, and for Wall Street. And the Republicans kind of miss this. I mean, it's one of the things that interests me about things like I'm doing here. A lot of established people missed what was happening on the ground in the same way that I think a lot of established people are maybe missing a lot that's going on. Like with K-pop and TikTok the other day, they didn't see that happening. And that's the same thing that happens in 1890. The Republicans refuse to admit that people are starving publicly, that people are starving on the plains. Their private letters say, crap, we got a problem. People are starving in Oklahoma. But publicly, they just say everything's fine. Anybody who's complaining about poverty is just not working hard enough. And they're eating meat, which is way too expensive for poor people. And, they've got fancy rugs on their floors. That's another big one that shows up in the newspapers. And they say, we can make everything better. We're going to go ahead and reform the tariff because that's what Democrats really want. And what common people want is they want those tariff walls down so they can get things cheaper from overseas. But instead, in October of 1890, when they reform the tariff, they actually raise the tariff. And they're actually people screaming at each other on the floor of Congress. And when they pass that law, the McKinley tariff, over the Democrats' votes, they start laughing and cheering. And one of the Democrats calls over to him and goes, "You're laughing now, but in November you'll mourn." And that's exactly what happened. In the midterm elections of 1890, people affiliated with the Alliance and with the Democrats sweep the Republicans out of Congress by a margin of 2-1. And the Congress is like, the Republicans in Congress are like, what the heck just happened? Literally, somebody finds Harrison in his garden walking around going, "What happened? What happened? I don't know what happened." And then he goes, "I just know it wasn't my fault." Anyway, so the Democrats sweep the midterms, and then they also sweep the election of 1892. 1892 is crucially important in American history because it is the first time since the Civil War that the Democrats control both houses of Congress and the presidency. They have re-elected Grover Cleveland, who moves back into the White House. But this is really important because Republicans look at that, Democrats back into control, and they say, that's it. America is over. The Democrats are going to destroy the country. Get your money out of the stock market. Stop investing in things. They don't know how to handle money. They're going to ruin everything. And what they mean is they're going to lower the tariff, but they literally go to the newspapers and say, you got to, rich guys, take your money out. There's going to be a depression and you must, and people are going to starve to death and they deserve it because they've put Democrats in office. So money starts to drain out of Wall Street and it starts to drain out of the stock market, and the economy is badly contracting with this panic. And at the same time that the Republicans have funded a bunch of, they've been trying to pay down what's a surplus in the budget, in the surplus in the budget. So the Treasury is shrinking. I mean, the money in the Treasury is shrinking really quickly. And people like J.P. Morgan run to Washington and they're like, do something, buy bonds, do something, put money back in the economy. And Harrison's like, no, I'm good. And the Secretary of the Treasury is a guy named Charles Foster. And he actually goes out in public and he says, hey, listen, all I got to do is I got to keep the Treasury solvent until March 4th when the Democrats take office. And then it's not my problem. So he literally sits for his portrait while all this is going on. His portrait hangs in the Treasury Department. He's one of the few portraits we have of a sitting Secretary of the Treasury because he's like, I got nothing to do. Economy's collapsing, but not my problem. Not quite. The economy collapses 10 days before Cleveland takes office. It happens on the Republicans' watch. You can watch it in real time nowadays thanks to the newspapers we have online. But Cleveland inherits a disaster because, among other things, what's happened is that generally in the big railroads, people get paid at the end of the month after they've done their work. So they've run up expenses all at the store and everything all month, but then they didn't get paid. The railroads went under before they could meet the payroll. So all of a sudden, entire industries collapse, and there's no mechanism at this time to figure out what to do. So Cleveland is trying desperately to calm Wall Street, which promptly infuriates all his Democratic supporters who told him not to work with Wall Street. And he's got this enormous crisis on his hands. And you see this in textbooks all the time, people blaming Cleveland for this. He inherited it. It happened 10 days before he took office. And he doesn't know what to do. He's doing the best he can. But Republicans simply go out in front of the people and say, "We told you. We told you the Democrats would destroy everything." And they said, if you want the economy to come back, you better elect Republicans. And that's exactly what happens in the midterm election of 1894. The Republicans get reelected, and it's the biggest midterm turnover in U.S. history because Americans are like, oh my God, we can't deal with this, because in the panic of 1893, you've got people like Coxey's Army marching on Washington demanding a jobs program, and you've got what looks like it's really going to be anarchy, and people are desperate to have that overturned. And of course, as soon as the Republicans are back in control of Congress, then they say everything's fine now, bring your money back. And people do. They reinvest in the economy. And when that happens, this is when we get the cementing of the idea that Democrats can't manage the economy. And it's completely a setup. You can tell I actually almost wrote a book on this. I cover it quite deeply in one of my books. I don't remember which one, but I almost wrote a book about this whole panic just because it was such a setup. Anyway, it's fascinating stuff. Then I lost interest in it, but it's interesting enough to do this with it. Anyway, so then you're looking at 1896. 1896 comes down to being a fight for the soul of America, really, because on the one hand, you've got Democrats saying, you Republicans have sold out to big business. Everything is about the rich. They're the ones who are running the show. They're the ones who are insisting on these tariffs. They're the ones who crashed the economy. They're the ones who are screwing over the workers. You've basically taken Lincoln's vision and you've turned it into not a place where you put effort at the bottom so that people can rise and people rise all the way up. You're simply saying that if you take care of people at the top, things will trickle down. And this is not what we think of as America. And in contrast to that, you have people like Grover Cleveland, who says, democracy is over, the rich have bought it. And you have people like William Jennings Bryan of Nebraska, whom Vachel Lindsay, the poet, called Bryan, Prairie Avenger, Mountain Lion. He had this vision, this image of being this great, large, literally large orator who embodied the American spirit, the Western spirit in that day and age. And he said, we're still the backbone of America. We farmers and we workers are still the backbone of America. And if you destroyed your cities, we could still rebuild them. But if you destroy us, your cities are going to fall to nothing. And in a funny way, he's actually sort of embodying what Lincoln had said, but now he's a Democrat. So all the election of 1896 comes down to is a question of money. And that, again, symbolizes a larger question. This larger issue. The Republicans back the idea of currency only in gold. People like William Jennings Bryan and the Democrats and a group called the Silverites back the idea of currency in silver. And the difference there, don't worry about gold and silver, but the difference is that gold money represents the Republicans and the idea of protecting big business, and silver represents looser money that's going to help farmers and workers and entrepreneurs. And this is where we get that famous Cross of Gold speech, where William Jennings Bryan says, "You shall not press down upon mankind this cross of gold. You shall not crucify mankind upon a cross of gold." And what he's really doing is obviously comparing, bringing in the religious imagery and comparing Jesus to the small American farmers rather than the big businessmen. But from the other side, the Republicans look at the rise of a Western farmer, a Nebraska man, a guy who's calling for looser silver money, And they see anarchy. They literally see anarchy, and they say, you do this, you're going to destroy America, you're going to ruin the country, you're going to have anarchy, you're going to have socialism, you're going to the whole country is going to be completely ripped apart. And actually, one of the people who's strongest about this is Theodore Roosevelt, who I'm going to tell you a lot more about next week. But it gets so bad that William Jennings Bryan goes to the Republicans and he says, guys, knock it off. You're really destroying the fabric of society here by insisting that I'm the Antichrist, basically. And they're like, no, this is war. And we're gonna go ahead and fight it this way, and this is how it's going to be done. So the election of 1896 comes down to this really fight over what America is going to be, and the Republicans win. They win with William McKinley, who is this extraordinary representative of big business government. Remember, it was the McKinley Tariff of 1890 that turned the people so dramatically against the Republican Party. And he's a wheelhorse, and he has been the chair of the House Committee on Ways and Means, which gave him great financial power. And he really is a corrupt big businessman. Not corrupt. He's a big businessman where he believes that what the government should do is protect big business. And he really believes that, and he wins in 1896. And there's this extraordinary well of discontent around the country, which kind of begs the question of why did McKinley make it as long and as far as he did with this extraordinary discontent, the huge numbers of strikes in this period, the people being so angry at big business Republicans. And the answer to that is going to come out of left field for a lot of you, I think. It certainly did for me. And that's that, think of the year 1896. That's the same year that gold was discovered in Bonanza Creek near the Klondike River in the Yukon Territory of Canada. And with that influx of gold into America, it loosens the money supply enough in America that people at the bottom feel like they've got a little more wiggle room than they did going into the election. And that insertion of this new gold, but also the idea that, by God, if you couldn't make it out in the Western prairies, you could go to the Yukon. You could strike out for the Yukon, and you could make it rich out there. Helps to rejuvenate the idea that maybe America still is a place where everybody can make it. So McKinley's presidency is really saved by the gold strikes in the Yukon, at least his first presidency. But within that success of the Republican Party in 1896, there is a groundswell of discontent. And that groundswell of discontent is going to take shape in the form of the political careers of people like Henry Cabot Lodge and Fighting Bob La Follette and Theodore Roosevelt, who are going to mount a dramatic challenge to this takeover of the Republican Party by big business in the late 19th century and usher in a new era of Republican history. Anyway, I took you through an hour of that. I love this stuff, as you can tell. Hope you enjoyed it. Hope you have some idea now why the crime of 73 was so important. And I will pick it up next week after Independence Day, doing the early 20th century. So thanks for being here. My name is Heather Cox Richardson. I'm a professor of history, but I do not speak for my employer when I do these. Those of you who are listening, many of you have asked me to do something on the Declaration of Independence, and I'm trying to figure out when to go ahead and do that. So you can give me suggestions. Obviously, I'd like to do it before the 4th, but look for an announcement about that because I am going to try and fit that in. Thank you very much for being here, and I will see you next week.